Hi, students. Welcome to the session on Marketing 3337, Chapter 16, Personal Selling and Sales Promotion. This is from the 18th edition of Principles of Marketing by Kotler and Armstrong. Today we'll be talking about personal selling and the evolving role of selling in the marketing mix. We'll also speak a little bit about sales promotion and the effectiveness of sales promotion in impacting customers and end users. So let's get started. The first slide I'd like to talk to here is about the definition of personal selling. So personal selling is a person-to-person communication with a prospect. The word prospect means not somebody who's necessarily buying our product or service, but somebody who may be interested in buying our product or service. So person to person, meaning the actual contact between one individual and another in the ability to sell a product or service. The personal selling is a process of developing relationships. So it's not transactional, it's relational. So it's developing relationships, discovering needs, matching the products and services to those needs, and then communicating the benefits of those products and services. So, and the idea here is the process is to add value above and beyond the product itself, such that the product is more needed by the particular consumer and acquired at a faster rate or a higher price or more preferred in the marketplace. So personal selling is the interpersonal part of the promotion mix. So when we think about the promotion mix, or the 4 Ps that we've been talking about, the thing about personal selling is it's either face-to-face communication, meaning people meeting together to be able to buy and sell. Think about, you going into a car dealership and meeting with a car salesperson face-to-face. It could be a telephone communication. Think about when somebody's ever sold you something over the telephone or called to be able to make a sale. Or it could be a more commonly now, particularly in this evolving phase, in the video or web conferencing mode. So somebody could do it over the computer in a video or web conference format, but any type of personal communication between 2 parties that allows the facilitation of a discussion that results in the potential sale of a product to a prospect. So let's talk about this concept of selling. I want to share with you 3 numbers here. The first is the number 900 billion. The next is 165 billion, and the other one is 34.9 billion. The really interesting thing here is, although we often talk about marketing in general, marketing as a concept and the investment in marketing, marketing actually only represents a total spend in the United States of $165 billion. Now that's a substantial amount of money, but if we think about that total spend on the selling function, this is of salespeople and sales incentives, it's about $900 billion. That's actually close to the gross domestic product of Russia. We spend in the United States on the selling functions and salespeople out in the marketplace. And then lastly, this number 34.9 billion is actually the amount spent last year on digital advertising. So if we look at this, 900 billion, 165 billion, 34.9 billion, you can see how important the marketing function is in selling is to the marketing function in relation to advertising, and then lastly, digital advertising. So the investment is tremendous in the area. Next, I want to identify the fact that there are 2 distinct kinds of selling that happen in the marketplace. One is business to business. We've talked about this quite a bit. So this is when one business sells to another business. And then next, business to consumer selling. And this is when a business sells to an end consumer that actually is going to use the product or service. So in business to business selling, some very common examples: a pharmaceutical salesperson. The pharmaceutical salesperson goes in and sells to a hospital drugs or drug products to a hospital, and then that hospital ends up distributing those products to patients from the hospital. Or that pharmaceutical sales rep goes and meets with doctors, and the doctor then distributes those products to the patient. So that is a business to business, because it's a salesperson facilitating the sale from the pharmaceutical company to another business that isn't the end consumer, but somebody in the chain of the sale. The next is CPG, consumer packaged goods. Think about companies like Frito-Lay, Procter and Gamble. So Procter and Gamble sells their products to department stores, grocery stores. They shelf these products, and then these grocery stores then end up selling those products to end consumers. So we have salespeople that go there and work with the stores. Like there's a person that sells to Walmart. There's people that sell to Kroger's. There's all those different salespeople that sell in their products to negotiate on shelf space and other opportunities for the company, so that they can then, that company like Kroger can then sell to the end consumer. And then we have manufacturing. Think of, for example, a paper company. So a company makes big, giant rolls of paper. They sell that to magazines or printing presses that can print that paper, and then those papers are then distributed, those magazines are distributed to end user books, for example, to end user consumers. So that's another example of business to business. So we have business to business, then we have business to consumer sales. That's like a retail salesperson, much more common from what you would be familiar with. Somebody, you go into a Nike store, they're selling you products there. You go to a Best Buy, you go to anywhere where a salesperson is selling product, that's retail. We have auto sales. We have a financial advisor. That is a person who might sell you financial services products. For example, work with you on your retirement plans, things like this, or even insurance agents that sell directly to you as well. Those are some examples of business to consumer. So we have business to business and business to consumer. Now, if we wanted to look at business to business, this just sort of demonstrates how much salespeople actually play a role in this. So you can see all of these, what we call broker agents that take place here, are salespeople in each of these situations. So you see here, this is a broker agent, this is a broker agent, a broker agent. These are really salespeople. So we can see a producer of consumer goods sells to a wholesaler. Who manages that? A broker agent. A business goods producer sells upstream to a wholesaler. Who sells that? A broker agent. So we see any of these that don't go directly to an end user. So in this situation, this person is doing B to C because it's going to an end consumer. This is a B2B, selling one business going to another business. So let's think about the actual Salesforce. Salesforce is a really interesting entity because you have salespeople. Let's say a company has 100 salespeople. These salespeople are out selling the products, representing the services for the company, doing everything they can to be able to make that company successful in the sale of their products to the marketplace. They do these activities. So these activities are the sales process they're doing to be able to sell their products to the market. So they're out there meeting with customers and selling. They have all this activity. That activity is targeted at customers that buy those products, and then those products produce revenue for the company. So that's the top line revenue that's produced for the company. On the other hand, salespeople also have a cost. So we know that each salesperson, we know how much we pay a salesperson each year, so their cost is really easy to calculate. So for example, for a salesperson, we might know that an average salesperson for our company makes $80,000 a year, and we have 1,000 salespeople, okay? Do some simple math, we can know exactly how much we're paying for our sales function, okay? But on the other side, the revenue function, it's less easy to be able to calculate. So we know the cost side of the business in sales, but it's hard to figure out what the investment results in revenue because there are so many factors that go into the purchase of products by customers. It's hard to identify that the salesperson themselves is the main source of the sale. So we know that the salespeople contact customers. We don't see how often they meet with them. We don't know what they say to the customers. We just know that they're selling products. So this top end of the chain here of the salesperson generating revenue is not easy to view. This bottom end of the expense side of the chain is really easy to view, where we know that these salespeople have a specific cost. The revenue and the cost result in a profit. So revenue production by salespeople, very difficult to figure out. Cost side, very easy to figure out. That's why companies really regulate the cost of their sales function, but it's hard for them to see what the impact that their sales function in particular is having on total revenue and total volume in sales. So as we think about salespeople, one of the questions that they'll often ask because of this investment is, how big a sales force should we have? How many salespeople should a company have out there in the sales force? What's the right number of salespeople? This is a very common question. So let's take a firm that is out there in the marketplace, and they want to figure out how many salespeople they need. All they have to do is they do what we call a workload approach. And I'm going to give you an example how a workload approach is calculated in the pharmaceutical industry. So we know that the average salesperson in the pharmaceutical industry makes about $90,000 a year, okay? We also know that the average salesperson in the pharmaceutical industry talks to about 8 doctors a day, 5 days a week, to be able to sell their products. So if they're talking to 8 doctors a day, 5 days a week, okay, we can do the math and we know how many sales meetings they have a week. And then we can actually calculate how many sales meetings they have a year. And then we can divide the total cost of a salesperson by the number of sales meetings. And so then we can figure out, given that number of sales meetings, how much does each sales meeting cost? So if a total salesperson costs $90,000 and we know how many sales meetings, we divide $90,000 by how many sales meetings a person has in a year. And then we can figure out, for example, the pharma industry, we figure out that an average sales call to a customer costs approximately $400 to a company. So every time a salesperson goes out to meet a customer, it costs that company $400. Now, what they have to ask themselves is, how many customers do they really need salespeople to meet? So they can figure out how many doctors there are and how often they want them to meet them. And that's how they calculate what's called the workload approach. So we know that we have 1,000 doctors. We figure out how many salespeople we need to cover 1,000 doctors, and then we're able to calculate the size of our sales force. So that's often called the workload approach. So workload approach, the sales force refers to the grouping of accounts into different classes to determine the number of salespeople needed. So an example on this, we might have doctors that, for example, are really high prescribing doctors. They're ones that prescribe lots and lots of products of ours. And then we might have very low prescribing doctors. We might want to call on the high prescribing doctors once a month, but the low prescribing doctors we only call on twice a year. So we can figure out that to calculate how much call coverage we need, and then we can figure out how many salespeople we need to match that call coverage. So in sales forces, we have different kinds of sales force structures. We have outside sales. They're the ones who actually physically go out and meet with customers. We have inside sales. These are the ones that actually work in tech support or sales assistants. They're the ones who work in a call center. They get on the phone and they work together often with outside salespeople to support them to sell products to customers. And then there's what we call team selling. And that's where groups of salespeople work together to manage the most complicated accounts that an organization has. I'll provide you an example of that. Siemens Corporation sells to IBM. IBM happens to be one of their 50 largest customers that buy from them. They buy over $1 billion of product from Siemens. So Siemens dedicates an entire team to manage the relationship with IBM. That's what we call team selling. So one of the really interesting things about salespeople is often people think that salespeople spend their entire day actually meeting with customers. When in actuality, this is a grid that sort of shows you the breakup of the average amount of time a salesperson spends on different functions throughout the day. And one of the things that's really interesting here is that most of their day is spent in administrative duties, things like filing reports, filling out paperwork for sales, filling out information for customers. but very little of their day is actually spent on actively selling products and prospecting and trying to get new customers. That actually only ends up being 20% of their total time here. So if we think about that, the actual time that they spend with customers and prospects is a small percentage of their total time that's spent on problem solving, some downtime, traveling between accounts, and then administrative duties are the bulk of their time that they spend. So I want to show you a short video about the evolution of selling that I want to talk about briefly. This is by an author. His name is Daniel Pink, and he shows a very interesting discussion in his new book about sales. It's called To Sell is Human, to talk about the evolution of the selling function.
What if everything we knew about sales turned out to be wrong? For instance, we think the only people in sales are the folks who try to get us to buy stuff. That's sales as we know it, and it's huge. It's how 1 in 9 Americans earns a living. But a cluster of economic and social forces has reshaped our world. See those other 8 in 9? They're now in sales too. School teachers, art directors, software writers. Whatever our job, we now spend a huge portion of our days trying to get others to part with resources, pitching colleagues, convincing clients, cajoling kids. Like it or not, we're all in sales now. But don't worry, this is a good thing, because sales isn't what it used to be. The old days were all about information asymmetry. The seller always had more information than the buyer, and that led to shenanigans. But today, information is everywhere. Whether we're pushing Buicks on a car lot or peddling ideas in a meeting, the world has moved from caveat emptor, buyer beware, to caveat venditor, seller beware. So the skeezy, sleazy, lowbrow, low road is less and less an option. And emerging in its place, from cutting-edge social science and some of the world's most innovative organizations, is a new approach to moving people. It doesn't depend on being slick or aggressive. Instead, you have to master 3 essential qualities.
Okay, so that gave you a little bit of background that Daniel Pink talked about. I think this was particularly interesting for us.
The new ABCs.
Because what it
Attunement.
does, it gives us a good introduction to the idea that that selling overall is changing the way that we engage in the function of being able to actually sell and motivate our products with our customers. We try to move to the next slide here. There we go. All right. So one of the things that Daniel Pink mentioned is that information symmetry versus information asymmetry. Let me mention this to you. First, information symmetry is when the buyer and seller are on an equal playing field. And that's a situation that's called the digital shift. And so what happened is, remember, he mentioned historically it was information asymmetric. That meant that salespeople had more information than the buyer. So if you went into a car dealership, the car seller would know so much more about the cars and about their cost than the buyer. But today, because there's so much available on the internet and so much research we can do, we can actually know almost as much as the buyer, and it puts us on a level playing field. And that causes information symmetry. So as a result, the salesperson has to bring a lot more to the table in the way they sell. They have to actually bring value and knowledge and apply things and help you get you into the right car. So what you expect of them is not just to give you descriptions of the cars and to tell you their price, but to actually add value to the conversation. Otherwise, you don't want to speak to a salesperson. So one of the things that we see is that it went from this caveat emptor to the caveat venditor. So before, it used to be the seller had all the power, and now it has the buyer and the seller on the equal playing field. So think about the way it changes the way selling takes place. There's less of a need for a salesperson. There's higher expectations of what a salesperson will deliver. And the salespeople also engage later in the connection with the customer. The customer's already done a lot of research on their product before they even speak with the salesperson. So this actually changes the entire dynamic between the buyer and the seller. So one of the things that we look at in selling is what we call the sales process. And I wanted to just share this with you. Our book goes into some detail on this, but these are some terms that I'd like you to become familiar with because in selling, we use them quite frequently. So the first is prospecting or qualifying, and that's where we go after a customer, a potential customer, and we determine whether they're valuable to us. The pre-approach is where we plan to meet with that customer and get all of our information together. The approach is where we first meet the customer and develop an introduction and get them to understand us and what our purpose is there. The presentation and demonstration is where we give information about our product or service and demonstrate the value of that product or service. Handling objections is where we manage any concerns on the part of the customer as to why they might not want to buy that product. Closing is the part where we actually ask the customer for the business and try to get them to actually make the purchase. And then follow up is what the salesperson does after the customer has actually made the buy. I'd like you to read in more detail and become familiar with the concept of the personal selling process. So now let's talk briefly about sales promotion. I think this is actually a pretty self-explanatory area, but I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about it. Sales promotions refer to short-term incentives to encourage purchases of products or services now. So an example of this, I'm thinking about buying some bedding for my house. I'm not sure I'm going to buy it now. I might be buying it later. But when they send me out a coupon from Bed Bath & Beyond, what does that do? It stimulates me. It gets me to say, wow, maybe I should go now and buy that product from Best Buy. Or buy that product from Bed Bath & Beyond right now. So what it is sales promotions try to get people to act quickly and impulsively to make purchases. So one of the things that sales promotions we see is there's been a rapid growth of these. Part of the reason is because there's so much competition and pressure in the marketplace. So there's so much pressure to be able to sell products because there's so many product offerings out there. The companies are facing this competition, so to be able to weave their way through the craziness of the brands and the clutter of the advertising, they put these promotions in place. So it's not unusual that you're walking through a grocery store and you see a promotion right on the shelf, 10% off, buy two, buy one, get one free, all those kinds of things, trying to draw you in and make purchases now right away to increase the rapid growth or acquisition of those products in the marketplace. So I want to wrap up this session by showing you a video. And I did an interview a year or so ago with Neil Rackham. He is the author of a book called Spin Selling, which is the most published sales book sold in the world. So this is Neil. He's a British citizen, lives here in the United States. I had the opportunity to go out and meet with him and talk about what his thoughts are about the evolution of the field of selling and how it's changing. So I'd like to share this with you, and I'd like you to watch this and get some of your thoughts on this. But anyway, I look forward to seeing you next section.
Hi, I'm Mike Ahern, co-author of Selling Today, Partnering to Create Customer Value. I'm here with Neil Rackham, best-selling author and leading sales educator. Neil, thanks for joining us today.
Hello, Mike.
Hi, Neil. I'd like to start off by asking you a little bit about what got you into selling. What motivated you to start studying the area of selling?
Yeah, sure. It was entirely by accident. I was a quite respectable researcher, and the work I was doing was trying to measure the way people interact with each other. Yeah,
Right.
Just looking at the kinds of behaviors people use. And I was using this to look at helping relationships like therapists and patients, or teachers and students. And one day someone said to me, "Why don't you study selling?" And I said, selling? Why would I do that? I'm respectable. And they said, well, here's the interesting thing. In the average sales force, the top 10% of people sell 3 times as much as the bottom 10%, and nobody knows why. And I thought, now that is an interesting question. I thought, I've got some methods that could help answer that. And so I started then looking at selling, and I haven't stopped since.
All right. And tell me a little bit, Neil, when you started working on teamwork, And you notice that, selling became very important, and selling in the field itself has become important. Tell me why selling has been a passion for you over time now.
Well, I've come to realize that selling isn't about persuasion. Why would I worry whether somebody persuades someone to take 20% more of their widgets? That didn't seem a really interesting set of issues. But the more I thought about it, the more selling becomes the thing that makes business work. Because there's a simple way of thinking about it. It's what happens in between companies that releases the value,
Right.
that creates the economy. Not just what happens inside companies. Nowadays, most companies are pretty efficient. They're moderately well run, they're productive, but the way companies work together isn't anything like so good. And the job of sales is to enable a company to work with other companies who are their customers in the best and most efficient and most valuable way. And looking at that way, it's a real contribution to the economy.
So can you tell us a little bit about what your original research uncovered, and what were some of your big aha findings that got you into working on books like Spin Selling?
Okay. Yeah, originally we just set out looking at selling to say, are the people who are succeeding doing anything that's different? And the first thing we discovered was pretty simple, and that is, in the successful sales calls, it's the customer who does most of the talking, not the salesperson. We also found salespeople who went in there and tried to push and get across the products, they would succeed in low-level selling, where you could make the sale in just a single call, or where the value of the product was fairly low. And they could succeed by enthusiasm, and they could have a rather aggressive type of selling, and that would work. But the moment you got into high-level selling that took many calls, the rules changed. And until that time, no one had ever thought of a difference. The old theory was selling is selling. In fact, there was some research done in the 1950s that said the first 30 seconds of a sales call determines your success more than anything else. Now, it so happens that research was done on students selling magazine subscriptions. So if you knock on a door, if you don't have a good pitch within 30 seconds, the door closes.
Right.
But IBM was teaching its mainframe computer salespeople who were selling multi-million dollar pieces of equipment that the first 30 seconds was the most important thing, because at the time that was the only action research. And of course, as we know, it's not. It's not really important at all. And yet, you can only teach the things that you know. And as we began to develop more sophisticated models of selling, we realized it was entirely different things. Questioning skills, in particular, came out as being hugely important. And successful people have a pattern of questioning. They ask the kinds of questions which clearly gain some initial understanding, but what they're doing is that they are seeing themselves as people who solve problems for customers. And if you don't ask about the problems, you can't solve them. So they asked a lot of questions about problems. But the really good ones, the top people, had a very different strategy. I might ask you, if I'm an ordinary salesperson and not that good, I'd say, Mike, do you have a problem with this? And you'd say, yes. And I'd say, let me tell you how our product can solve it for you. So I'd jump in with answers. We found that the top salespeople didn't give their answers, didn't give their solutions until very, very late in the sales call. And what they were doing was they were taking the problem and they were going into more depth. They were looking at its implications. So they'd be more likely to say, Mike, does that problem mean it's slowing down your other functions? Is that upsetting your customers?
Right.
What effect is it having? And then when we looked at the very top salespeople, they asked another type of question too, questions about value. Questions about, why is that important? How would that help you? Because the mistake that people make in selling is, if the customer says, your product's great, they say, fabulous, I'm glad you think so. The really good people say, why? What's so great about it? Tell me what you like. Tell me how it would help you. Because they get the customer talking in the customer's own words about how helpful a solution might be. Things like this came out of the research.
So that's really what, as you were talking about this implication, that's really where the sort of the heart of spin comes from, right? So
Yes.
the implication part of spin. So so when you were thinking through the spin situation, problem, implication, need, payoff, what made you think to yourself, well, let's come up with that acronym and let's think about this I in spin.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is the S, P, and I are the same in almost all languages. In French, situation, problème, implication, same German. So in most languages, situation, problem, implication are well understood terms. The difficulty was you have the SPI. What should the acronym be? And think of the questions in the last type of questions being questions about value. So the obvious acronym is SPIV. But you'll tell from my accent that I'm a Brit. And in colloquial Brit, SPIV is a guy who comes to you in the street and says, you want to buy a stolen watch? And so it was too down market. So we called it spin, and we did this in the days before spin meant what it usually does now. But it's not a great acronym, it's not a great name, but it's stuck and it's widely used.
Well, it's very memorable. I mean, and I would say that it's one of probably the most memorable selling techniques that's out there. You talk to any salesperson, it's had a tremendous impact on people.
Certainly, something like 6 million people have bought the book over the years. And at one time, maybe even now, more than half of the Fortune 500 trained their people on the method. So it's a very, very well-known method. But the reason why it's been successful, I think, are two things. Number one, it's based on research. And not many people had done any research in this area before this came along. And the other is, it's about the bigger and more complex sale. And here's the important thing. Smaller sales, simple sales, are going away. More and more they're going to the internet. They're being run, controlled by marketing, not by sales. So the sales job of the future will be about the larger, more complex, more sophisticated sale. And that's what this spin model was designed to work on.
Well, let me ask you about that a little bit. I mean, you're going in a direction I think that would be really valuable for the students to learn about, which is you're out there working with companies all the time. What are the biggest trends that you see right now in selling and the markets? How are they evolving right now?
Perhaps the biggest single trend is this. In almost every field, there's competitors everywhere. More competitors than ever before. Some people estimate that in the last 5 years, in the average marketplace, there are twice as many competitors as 5 years ago. So most companies have competitors, and most products do the job perfectly well. So what's happened is the difference is no longer in the product. And for example, you buy a car 20 years ago, and the difference in the number of defects on delivery between the best and the worst was more than 50 to 1. Today, it's much less than 2 to 1. Yeah?
Yeah.
In every field, products have got more reliable, the quality is better, the price is very similar. And so how's the customer going to choose today? Well, one of the big trends is more and more customers say, it's not the product. I could go to any of 3 vendors. What I care about is how it's sold. Does the person who sells it help me solve my problem better than their competitors? So how you sell is becoming more important than what you sell. Now, what this does mean is there's a tremendous demand today for competent salespeople. They're in short supply globally. It's a great time to be going into sales.
Let me ask you as a follow-on to that, with this intense competition in the marketplace, and obviously the internet and social media playing such a big role, if we look back about 20 years ago, everybody was talking about this concept of disintermediation. That is, companies using the internet to sell directly to customers and completely getting rid of intermediary salespeople. They were talking about the sales job vanishing completely. And so if that had been realized today, we wouldn't have any salespeople. How has the internet actually played out with salespeople, and how has it changed their job?
What the internet has done has changed in two huge respects. One being that it's a convenient way of purchasing for people who know the solution, who know the answer. If I know what I want, I might be buying, say, a digital recorder. Well, okay, the easiest thing to do is go on the internet and see who has the best price, never have to talk to a salesperson. So a lot of standard products have gone to the internet, and the internet has taken that market away, and it's left the area which is customized, more complex, more sophisticated, that needs a salesperson to make it happen. The other thing that the internet has done is it's given customers information. It doesn't matter if your product has 100 competitors. If the customer only knows of one other competitor, you only have one other competitor. Today, customers know about every single competitor. They know about you and mistakes they've made. They can do their research. And what's that meant for selling is if you are what I call a talking brochure, if you're someone who says, Mike, let me tell you what a good product we have. Customers don't want that. They don't need that. They even resent that. The number one customer complaint about salespeople is they come and pitch product. So if they're not doing that, what should they do? And the answer is they should help me solve my problems.
So part of what you're saying really goes back to the whole spin concept, which is really this bringing value to the customer. And so one of the things you're indicating, and I'd like you to speak on this a little bit more, is this concept that salespeople now bring value not necessarily by communicating basic information about products and services, but solving problems. Can you articulate on that a little bit to let us know what that trend looks like?
Sure. Philip Kotler, the great marketing guru who maybe more than anyone invented modern marketing, in his original great marketing textbook, he wrote, "The purpose of marketing is to create customer value, and the purpose of selling is to communicate that value to the customer." Because in those days, selling was a communication channel. Where else could the customer find about your product, what it could do and what it couldn't do? In those days, they had to see a salesperson. And the job of the salesperson was to communicate that the product had some outstanding and useful things. Well, today that's no longer true for two reasons. One reason is products are more similar, so other competitors' products could do it too, so your product doesn't have something special to communicate. The other thing is that the idea of communication has been made totally redundant by alternatives like the internet. So under those circumstances, Philip Kotler would be the first person to say that's no longer true today. So the function of selling has shifted from being communicating value, communicating the products and services to the customer, to becoming creating special value. And the simple way of putting it was, maybe 20 years ago, if you were selling mousetraps, you'd be saying, let me tell you why our mousetrap is better than theirs. You'd be communicating the value of your mousetrap. But now, there's 100 different ways of killing mice. There's glue traps and mouse traps and ultrasonic traps and green traps and blue traps. There's every type of trap you could imagine. So how do you sell it? Well, you don't communicate the value of your mousetrap. What you do is you say things to the customer like, the best time to put a mousetrap down is about 8 o'clock at night. Always use gloves, because the mice will otherwise smell you. This is the best kind of cheese to use in bait. What's the salesperson doing there? The salesperson is creating value by being an expert on how the product is used. And that's value creation. And that's the future.
It's interesting you talk particularly about this creation of value and the solution of problems. Do you have any recommendations in particular for these students as they develop their careers in selling on how they can do the best job of creating value. Are there any particular strategies that the top salespeople use?
I think the number one strategy is focus on the customer, because you create value by helping the customer and solving their problems, not persuading them that they should buy your products. So the first issue there is the deeper you understand the customer, the more value you can create. Because a product or a service is only a tool to help customers solve problems, to improve their efficiency or whatever. And you can only help them with that by understanding them and their business. This is why there's been a swing away from sort of sales training in some of the techniques that you might use to sell your products, towards sales education, which says the salesperson of the future has to understand business. See, if I were teaching sales to students today, I would say selling has to be part of a real business sophisticated education. You need to understand finance. You need to understand the whole mechanism of, say, quality improvement. You need to understand how the processes of a company work. In order to understand the customer's decision making, you have to understand organizations, you have to understand budgeting. There are so many things which are broadly educational, where selling is what links them all together and makes it happen.
Do you ever see the capability of technology to the point where it would completely eliminate the job of a salesperson?
Oh yes, yes. The lower level jobs, like just explaining the product, showing how it can be used, you can increasingly automate that. And even some of the higher level ones. When Haworth, the furniture manufacturers, were finding on their modular furniture, out of 6 million combinations, their salespeople were selling less than 1,000. So they said, okay, why don't we build an online configurator which will allow salespeople to just enter in things and it will help prompt them on products that might fit. Well, that was great, very popular, but then customers started saying, well, why do we need the salesperson? Just give us the configurator and we'll do it for ourselves. And they did. So what you find is some things tend to get automated. What you can't automate at the moment, and maybe not in the foreseeable future, you can't automate creativity. You can't automate really listening to the customer and figuring out what would really help most here. Of the various solutions, how can I tweak this one or change that one? It's that's the selling of the future, and we think it's highly unlikely that that's going to be automated within the next 50 years.
Well, thank you, Neil, for taking the time and talking with us today. This was really valuable. We appreciate your time.
Glad to do it, Mike. Thank you.